All right, well, welcome back to week 2 of Distracted. Just by way of recap, we talked last week in part 1 about technology was one of the things we mentioned, and how technology allows us to do a whole lot of things. We can not only make phone calls, but we can video chat or watch our favorite shows or check emails or send messages. We can order up a pizza. There's so much things that we can do just with a phone in our hand these days, but it hasn't made life less busy, has it? And in some sense, even though some things we can do with a little more ease, we've become a multitasking society, expected to do more, to get more done, and to be more productive, and how this often serves as a distraction. In the Roman Empire, we talked about Roman Empire during Jesus' time, how they were conquering the known world at the time, much of it, and that they were using distractions like entertainment in order to pacify the masses that they had subjugated, so that they would be talking more about the next gladiatorial games and who was going to win, or the next theater show that was going to go on, or what the emperor was saying or going to do or going to show up at a certain place or at a certain theater, rather than focusing on what was most important. We talked about how most of humanity is distracted most of the time, and that includes you and me. Today we've got things like 24-hour news that we're always plugged into, and we've got divisive politics. Politics that's important, and maybe you've been called to such a thing and to be involved in such a thing, but most of us, we're just watching it on TV and being fed by certain media, and all of them are a bit tainted, and we just have these half-truths, and we get so caught up in it, and we're fighting, and we're angry about things, and we're fighting for this, and it's kind of like watching our favorite football team or baseball team. We feel great when they're winning, and we feel upset and frustrated with someone when they're losing, and ready to fight more and come back again. And mostly what we're doing is really, when in reality, is just sitting on the couch and being distracted. We talked about how all of Scripture is really a call for us to refocus, or to center our focus on what is central, and that's life with God and our spiritual growth and formation. That's what we're here for. That's the purpose of this life. Are we growing? We referred to a verse that could certainly seem rather jarring, Matthew 10:28, but we explained that too, and how it's really a call just to focus on the thing that doesn't change, and the thing that's most important, that is God. Matthew 28 says, "Do not be afraid of those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Now, we are going to continue to use this as our foundational scripture as we continue what really is just going forward from last week in the same topic. We noted how this verse isn't really calling us to focus on hell, though some have used it that way, or it could become a distraction that way, but really it's a call to focus on God. We discussed and discovered how we often get focused on the expectations of men and society, but all of these people and their expectations are just fleeting. They change as quickly as public opinion or the latest news headlines. They fade out with those who fade out with death, and those who come up behind them have different ideas on how things should be, and things are constantly changing, and it feels like you can't hit the target because the target's always moving. But on the other hand, or in contrast, the verse is showing that God is eternal. The passage calls us to set our eyes on what's eternal. God doesn't change like the opinions of men or the latest cultural fads. He's the one who determines our ultimate destiny, so why look any other place than to Him for our direction? So last week, we talked about the expectations of men and society and culture. This week, we're going to talk a bit about our own expectations and how these too mostly serve as distractions. Expect nothing. These are the two words I sense Jesus saying to me at a time in my life that I was learning some of the greatest lessons that I needed to learn. At a time in my life, I was 19 years old, and I was in a very difficult situation. God was waking me up. He was trying to get a hold of me, get my attention. I found myself being wheeled down the hallway of a hospital corridor on a bed. My whole world had been turned upside down, and I didn't know if I was going to live or die. In fact, I was expecting that I was going to die, and I had this vivid sense through the midst of it all, of Jesus' presence, which is interesting because though I had somewhat of a Christian background, I wouldn't have considered myself Christian. I certainly wasn't pursuing God or his intentions for my life. I was distracted by many other things. And I felt like Jesus was talking me through the whole thing. I wondered if I was going to find myself standing before God, and as I thought about that, I feared that it wasn't going to go well because, I hadn't been living life with any kind of intentionality. And I started imagining all the possibilities of what that might look like and how I might navigate it, and of course being anxious because I knew that I had no control. That's when I sensed Jesus say these two words to me: expect nothing. It was sort of a call just to place my trust in him as my advocate, but also to stop trying to figure things out or manipulate things and just expect nothing. I live to see another day, but it's taken me years to figure that statement out. We're always trying to figure everything out, aren't we? We come up with an idea of how things obviously should be, but of course nothing is as it ought to be. That's the lesson of Genesis 3, right? Everything got turned upside down. Nothing is the way that it should be, and we're incapable of doing what should be done because we're all really just figuring it out as we go. When this pandemic is all said and done, everyone's going to fault everyone else for what and how things should have been done. We're going to know, it's going to be obvious to all of us exactly how things should have been done. But the truth of the matter is that you don't know, I don't know. Most of us are just armchair politicians or couch potato theologians. We don't know. None of us do. In the same way, expect nothing. When you think that things should work out some specific way or move forward in some certain direction, and you're filled with this expectation of how things ought to be, but of course nothing ever goes a certain way, does it? We humans are too fickle for that, and our world is much too erratic because everyone has an opinion and everyone has a perspective. Each of us has a will to act according to our own fashion, and all of our actions create a variety of possible outcomes, and nothing goes as expected because everyone is working toward a slightly different end, aren't they? There is no cure or control for this except to expect nothing. Expect nothing because nothing is going to go exactly the way that you think it should. And when your expectations fail, you end up sitting around, stewing in your discontent. And this too is just a distraction. In the 12-step program, there's a saying: expectations are premeditated resentments. Expectations are premeditated resentments. In other words, when you expect a certain outcome, you're really just setting yourself up to be disappointed. One of the places I learned this lesson really well, it was a great lesson, a freeing lesson actually, was when I was on tour with George DeYoung, and he was taking us on a trip called Out of Egypt, and we were literally starting in Egypt and working our way to Jordan and then into Israel, following the Israelites' trail from Egypt out of slavery and into the Promised Land. And we had a bit of an itinerary, like we knew pretty much where we were going to be each day as far as the region, but it didn't say what we were going to be doing or what sites we'd be seeing. And so there was always a lot of questions like, hey, are we going to see this? Or are we going to do that? And George, Rabbi George, who was kind of taking the position of Moses, leading us as God led him, would often say this: let's see what God gives. Let's see what God gives. He wouldn't tell us exactly what. I figure there's probably a couple of reasons for this. One of the reasons why is because, who knows how things are going to turn out. I'm sure he had an agenda, an itinerary, but of course, he's done this many times and he knows things happen. Things change. For instance, we got to Israel and we were supposed to go do a few things that he had on his itinerary, but he said, hey, I got to change some things around. Why? Because it was the Jewish New Year and everything was shut down. So we didn't know what we missed because he never told us. And oftentimes he would just say, let's see what God gives. And that's something that I took with me. Let's see what God gives. I would like to see this. I'd like to see that. I'd like to do that. Let's see what God gives. And instead of expecting, we'll receive what God has for us. So instead of becoming discontent or resentful because discontentment always leads to resentment because we're always going to blame someone for why things didn't work out. Instead, find yourself where you really are. Accept the way that things actually are. Respond as you should within the circumstances in which you find yourself. What's really happening right now, and how would God navigate you through what is actually happening? How do you meet God in this moment, as this moment actually is? What is God calling forth from you in the midst of these actual circumstances? God doesn't work in what ifs and what should be's. God is a living and he's active in the reality of the present moment. He doesn't meet you in the angst of your disrupted utopia. He meets you in the midst of the reality of what is. Caroline Myss says, just let go. And let go of how you thought your life should be and embrace the life that is trying to work its way into your consciousness. Let go of how you thought things should be and learn the lessons that reality has to teach you, that your real experiences have to teach you. There's not one person on the place of planet Earth that God isn't involved with. He's trying to get our attention, every single one of us. And when we're not conscious of him because of our distractions, he's working as best as he can on a subconscious level. And it doesn't matter how young or how old you are. If you're still alive, he's not done with you yet. Age isn't the issue, but distraction often is. Therefore, expect nothing. Because when you're focused on what you expect to see, well, you're going to fail to see and respond to what actually is. You'll be too busy trying to figure out your anticipated outcome, and you're going to miss the lesson that God actually has for you in the reality of the moment. You'll be too busy trying to anticipate some dystopian future that will never find its place in reality. So accept what it is as it is and change yourself. This is a lesson that Israel had to learn. The northern kingdom of Israel had already been conquered by Assyria sometime around 721 BC. And around 587, 588 BC, Judea, the southern kingdom of Israel, was going to be conquered by Babylon. They came in, conquered Jerusalem, and took many of the Israelites or the Jewish folks out and as captives to Babylon. And as many of the people were looking back toward the promised land, looking back toward Israel, wondering, God, when are you going to bring us back? When are you going to get us back to normal, back to the way life should be, back to what we're used to? God sent a prophet, Jeremiah, and sent a word to those Israelites who only had their focus on going back to Israel and when this was all going to be over. And he said, in a paraphrase, this: Babylon is going to be your new reality. Your children's children might return to Israel, but you won't. Therefore, adopt and adapt to your new circumstances and live within the reality of these circumstances. You're in Babylon now. So rather than wishing you were in Israel, figure out how to be God's people in the midst of the reality in which you actually find yourself. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city, because this is the world that you're now in. In other words, seek to grow in your identity as the children of God in the midst of the circumstances that you're in. This in and of itself will lead to the betterment of society as a whole. Wishing that you were somewhere else doesn't do you or anyone else any good. What is God saying, doing, teaching, shaping in you in the midst of what is actually happening right now? In conclusion, we are a distracted people. We're so busy trying to create a utopian society that the only thing really arising out of all of our efforts is more chaos. Because for our utopian dream to come true, everyone else has to conform to our perspective. They have to become mere extensions of ourselves. Like infants, we need to mature and go through the painful realization that the world around us isn't just an extension of ourselves. Other people are their own entities with their own visions and their own dreams, and oftentimes they're trying to make you an extension of their own hopes. Instead, each of us must awaken to the reality in which we find ourselves in, the city that we find ourselves in. Are you in Babylon rather than your own personal promised land? Well, welcome to reality. This is why the Bible calls us pilgrims and sojourners, foreigners and aliens in a land not our own. Rather than trying to conform this reality to your reality, instead you need to discover the reality of who you are in the midst of the reality of the place where you find yourself. Stop trying to change and conform everything around you. Understand that the greater reality is that in Him you live and move and have your being. You're already home. Because wherever you are, you can find yourself in God. And when you find yourself in God, that's when you truly find yourself, the person He's created you to be. What does this mean? It means become the person that God's created you to be. That's what you're here for. Do the things that you have to do, of course. Go to work, take out the trash, cook dinner, paint the house. But don't neglect the greatest task of all. Become who God says you are. Find God, and you'll find yourself. There are so many things that have to be done, and there are so many things that we're doing that don't. Don't forget the main reason why you're on this earth, to find God and discover your true self. Have you been about your primary task, or have you been distracted? Don't try to figure out all the ways that you've been distracted, because that in itself can become a distraction to you. Instead, discover what draws you nearer to God and helps you in the discovery of discovering yourself. Discovering yourself is only a distraction if it doesn't lead to something more or something else. But if all that you do begins flowing out of the discovery of who you truly are in God, who God has created you to be, well, then you'll be more productive than anything that you could possibly do doing anything else. When Scripture says, "Fear not what men can do to you, but rather fear God," it's not telling us to become frozen with fear. What we fear is what we put our trust in. What we fear is what we put our trust in. When you fear something, you're trusting in its power over you, for good or for ill. So to fear men is to trust in their power over you. But all men are merely mortal and will all stand before God and give account. To fear God is to trust in God's power over you. That's why it reminds us to focus on Him, because He's the one who holds our destiny in His hands. To fear God is to remember why you are here and to pursue that purpose with all your heart. Last week we quoted Rabbi Zusya, who said, "On the day of judgment, God will not ask me, 'Why were you not Moses?' He will ask me, 'Why were you not Zusya?'" Scripture is reminding us that one day we will find ourselves standing before God, and He will not ask you why you weren't more like Billy Graham, or anyone else for that matter. He'll ask us why we weren't more like ourselves. That is, the person that He created and calls us to be. If what we spend our time doing flows out of distraction rather than discovery, then it will not survive the fire of testing that Paul talks about. It will just come to nothing. But whatever flows out of who we truly are, who God created us to be, well, that will last for eternity, because it's truly a part of us.